Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this questions answered video, the question is, what should I be doing? What are some tips for dry fire practice? Dry fire practice is critical to self-defense training, self-defense practice. The reason being is most people are probably going to be able to get more repetitions without firing live ammunition than they are with firing live ammunition, because range access, travel, expensive ammunition, things of that nature, and just being able to find the time. Whereas at home, we can practice safely a lot of those techniques. The only technique that you really can't practice when we're thinking about square range shooting is the actual shooting of the gun, managing recoil and things of that nature, sight picture reset and everything like that. But everything else, and there's a lot more than maybe you think, can be practiced in a dry fire setting. Now, when some people think dry fire, they think the actual mechanical press of the trigger, and that's just part of it. There's some things that you can work on. Some things maybe you want to focus all your practice attention on for that day that don't involve pressing the trigger at all. Now, the first and most important thing is to come up with a plan and stick with it. I want to come up with a block of time, and I want to be able to dedicate that much time, however much time it is, to my dry fire practice every single day. Now, I'm not going to do the same thing necessarily every single day, but I need to make sure I set off that block of time. For me, it's 15 minutes. I want to dedicate 15 minutes of every single day to dry fire practice. Sometimes I just don't have the time to even get in that 15 minutes, but more often than not, I'm going to hit my mark every single day. It's actually pretty rare these days that I'm not able to get in that 15 minutes. Now, is 15 minutes sufficient? It's a reasonable amount of time to perform a reasonable amount of repetitions based on what I'm working on for that day, that I don't feel rushed, but I also don't feel like I'm not getting enough time for that particular skill set. If I have 20 minutes, I'll take 20 minutes. If I have 30 minutes, I'll take 30 minutes. But that 15-minute mark for me is kind of like a sweet spot. It gives me enough time to get in really, really good reps without, like I said, feeling rushed or feeling like I'm not getting enough time in for whatever skill set I'm particularly working on for that day. Now, how specific you get, obviously, has to do with what you're trying to focus on. If you've been to the range and identified some problems, like my draw is kind of garbage or my draw needs work. The draw is something that, and I talk to students about this all the time, if you come to one of my classes, first time I've ever had you in class and your draw just isn't very good, I have to wonder what you've been doing in your dry fire practice. Because the draw is something that I can definitely work to perfection, at least in one area, before I ever take a class. If I want to isolate a technique such as the draw, that'll be my 15 minutes, but I'm not just going to mindlessly perform the draw stroke over and over and over again. I'm going to take whatever technique I'm working on and I'm going to break it down into sections. First, I'm going to take a look, like using the draw as an example. How's my clearance speed looking? Okay, that was pretty quick. But then I'm going to try to work through it and think of what mistakes or what inefficiencies did I make along the way. So let's say, well, my clearance wasn't very good. So I'm literally just going to work on shirt up, hand on gun. Shirt up, hand on gun. Shirt up, hand on gun. And I'm going to go through that 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 reps. And then, working with that same speed, I'm going to work on my presentation. And then I'm going to reset. I'm going to take my time working back to the holster, but I want to come out of the holster fast when it's time to come out of the holster fast. I want to work on that isolation of techniques, isolation of steps. So I literally may break it down even further than that. I may just work on, okay, shirt, and use my hands from different positions. The surrender position is great, but there's a very distinct possibility that your draw stroke may occur in the performance of another task. Like I'm on my phone, or I'm reaching for a door handle, or any number of other things. This is possible. Somebody may be like, hey, give me your wallet, and you got to put your hands up, and I get it. But it's also just as likely for your hands to be somewhere completely else, like in your pockets. Think about working and getting away from the constants, such as hands up surrender position, because it can happen in any other position. So think about kind of isolating the clearance, not always from here, but from any number of other places. And then once I feel like, okay, my clearance is good, my clearance is good, my clearance is good, no matter where I'm coming from, then I'm going to start working on the actual purchase of the gun. Am I driving my hand deep enough into the back strap on the gun to make sure I have a solid purchase on the gun every single time before I begin my draw stroke? Am I driving the gun too far down into the holster, too far right, too far left? Obviously I'm left-handed, so it's going to be a little bit different for me. Is there any inefficiency in the way that I put my hand on the gun? Those of you who carry from the hip, obviously this is going to be different. Your clearance technique is going to be different, and I get that, but the fundamentals of it remain the same. How much can I break down my draw stroke? I don't want to necessarily break it down into steps, because I look at a draw like jumping a puddle. There's a start and there's a finish. When I start, I know what my destination is. I don't think about what happens in the middle. That kind of makes sense? So my draw stroke is gun, full presentation. If I know my final destination is going to be close retention, then I don't think about going to full extension at that moment. I think about clearing the gun, if I have the luxury of using two hands, and shooting from retention. That's just the way I'm going to apply my methodology to the way that I'm practicing just this isolated technique. Still using that draw stroke as our example, if I feel like my clearance is good, and I feel like my draw stroke is good, and I feel like my presentation is good, now, instead of just picking up sights on nothing, I'm going to start picking up sights on various objects in the room. I may even set up little targets. One of my favorite things to use is light switches and outlets, because they're small. No matter where I am, they're always going to be relatively small. So as I perform my draw, I pick up that light switch and I get my sight picture. The next time I do it, I may work to a little faster, or I may vary, like, oh, there's one over there. Okay, that's good. And I'm going to work at kind of a half speed until I get comfortable with picking those sights up. How many different things should I try to stack into my dry fire practice? Since we're just talking about the draw and presentation of the gun, let's talk about the steps. I've got garment clearance, I've got hand purchase, I've got draw, I've got two hands meeting, I've got presentation, I've got sight picture, and I can add trigger press. That's actually a lot of things to work on at one time. Now, obviously, all those things have to happen in order to fire live ammunition, especially in a self-defense situation. It's not like you can isolate the skills then. But when we're practicing, do we have to do every single one of those steps if we're just working on the draw stroke? Can I spend 15 minutes just working on the purchase? I think I can. I don't know if I would, because once we get bored, we tend to start to cut corners. And that's where inefficiencies get introduced into our repetitious movement. It's called muscle memory. That's what everybody calls it. There's no such thing as muscle memory. It's actually Hebbian plasticity. And I know what you're talking about when you say it, and I get that, but words do mean things. So let's be technically correct. Hebbian plasticity is building neural pathways. We want to build correct neural pathways. Now, some of you watching this may have heard, well, it takes 3,000 to 5,000 reps to build proper motor function. I addressed this in a previous questions answered video. It's actually 300 to 500 at inception. But if you're doing it wrong, it's going to take 3,000 to 5,000 to fix it. So that's an issue. So when I talk about just isolating to that degree, literally just shirt up, hand on gun, shirt up, hand on gun, if we get bored, we get sloppy. And if we get sloppy, some of those reps are going to be sloppy reps. If every single rep is as perfect as possible, our ultimate Hebbian plasticity is going to be better. It's going to be a higher functioning degree, a higher functioning technique, than if we allow in sloppy reps here and there. Because 300 to 500 reps doesn't sound like a lot until you do it and try to do it all at one time. If you want to check this for yourself, literally, the next time you're ready to do some dry fire practice, think about, okay, garment gun, garment gun, garment hand on gun, garment hand on gun, garment hand on gun, and do it, and do it, and do it. And then catch yourself the very first time that you get sloppy, and you are going to go with it anyway. And that's something that we want to avoid. So, do you want to isolate just this? Not for the entire time. I wouldn't recommend it. That's why I said 10 to 15 reps. And it's the same with anything, any technique. I don't want to do 300 emergency or slide lock reloads without introducing something else in there to kind of break up the monotony and to make sure that I'm focusing specifically on the technique in which I want to maximize my efficiency. Now, facetious or not, the internet is correct. You are a unique snowflake. So what works for you might not work for someone else. What works for me might not work for you. So I would recommend using this more of a guideline rather than an altar to worship at. I definitely don't want people thinking they have to do it my way, but I'm trying to give you some advice, especially the person who asked the question, to really underscore the appreciation of our dry fire time. And we've been focused on the handgun, most of the draw, but what other techniques, what other skills do I need for the operation of the handgun? Okay, so we've got the gun out, what comes next? Well, trigger press is a thing. Now, using the SIRT pistol is pretty good. but the trigger isn't exactly realistic. It does give me trigger press. I get the cool little lasers so I can see where I'm hitting, and that's great. But what may be more important than that is getting used to less than ideal situations. So just focusing on the draw again for just a second. One hand, gun, presentation. Awesome. What happens when this hand is not available? Have you thought about that? Is it likely that this hand may become injured? That's possible. It's usually the support hand that's injured. If you look at actual real life use of forces where one of the hands have been injured, it's usually the support hand, but it can be the primary hand too. Most likely to least likely. So how is your one-handed draw technique? Have you thought about it? Is it smooth? Is it seamless? Is it fast? It's never going to be as fast. I think I can say this definitively. It's never going to be as fast as a two-handed draw technique, but it can be so close that no one who's watching can tell the difference in speed. Kind of makes sense? So if I don't have this hand available to me, how do I draw the gun with this hand? Well, it seems kind of intuitive. I got to get the shirt out of the way, and I got to get my hand on the gun. But can my hand do both at the same time? Technically, no. Now, the way that I do it is I roll the shirt underneath my wrist, get my thumb behind the gun, draw, and present. I come out forcefully just in case I get some shirt in my hand. I can pull out of it. Because if I don't have a really strong grip on it and there is shirt in my hand, I may lose the shirt and the gun, which obviously isn't ideal. That is a less than ideal situation with the draw stroke. So if I've got my 10 to 15 minutes dry fire, can I break up just the draw and practice isolation of the presentation and the one-handed technique, introduce that into that. Think about introducing asymmetrical stress into this arm. I don't want you just mindlessly putting it against your chest or tucking it in your back pocket. That's a training artificiality more than it is anything else. You can isolate just that one-handed technique and just work that. And then think about what other situations might I have to draw my gun in. Have you thought about drawing your firearm where you're laying on your back or laying on your side or any other number of physical situations like sitting? Are you working that into your dry fire time? There's so much that you can get done without ever actually pressing the trigger, but pressing the trigger is just as important. Don't get me wrong, things like the CERT, great training aids, but nothing is a replacement for the actual weight and feel of your actual carry firearm. If I want to work technique on the trigger, I'm more likely to use this than I am the CERT pistol. I use the CERT pistol for a number of different things, but when it comes to actual dry fire practice, this is what I go with. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different opinions on how to actually perform our trigger press operation. It gets down to the debate over what should the finger do on the trigger when the gun cycles. There's a thing called slapping the trigger. And I'm actually going to address this in a future video, so I'm not really going to get into it right now, but I want my finger to perform the same way in dry fire that it does in real life. So if I'm one of those guys that I shoot, I hold the trigger to the rear, and then I ride out reset after the gun cycles through as my sights settle, then I want to do that. Even though that might not be technically correct, that might just be the way you taught, I want to keep doing that to build that proficiency. Me, I am a trigger reset anticipation shooter. So when I fire, bang, the gun cycles. As it cycles, I remove my finger from the trigger, I know, right? And I put it where the trigger is going to reset to. So just now, the trigger popped out under maximum power. Because if you think about it, if I'm riding the trigger out, I'm actually slowing its reset speed. Even if it's only 100th or 1,000th of a second, time is time. I would much rather put my finger in a position where the trigger is going to come to. If you look at some of the fastest shooters in the world, that's what they do. I didn't invent it, I got it from them, and I think it makes a whole lot of sense because sometimes speed is the most important ally you have in actually working that trigger. What is important when we talk about actually doing the dry fire, the actual trigger press? Well, the first thing that's important is making sure your sight picture is as steady as possible when you break the trigger. That's super important, but varied degrees of importance. Is it important to be able to draw, get a target, press? Absolutely. That's something that you should be working on because that first round may be the most important round. But you also need to work on reset. This is where we have a problem with dry fire. This is where that first round, that first sight picture is pretty realistic because there will be no settling recoil on that first round. But that second round will be after the gun cycles and recoils. So how well can I practice that technique? I had an instructor of mine probably about a decade ago. His advice was, when you do dry fire, just work that first round, and only that first round, because that's the only round that you can accurately replicate the trigger press. Because every other round after that is most likely after recoil, and you cannot replicate recoil in dry fire. There is some wisdom in that. There's some great wisdom in that. I don't agree with it, but I see where his mindset was. And I get it, and he did that technique very, very well. He was never a guy that you would find after getting that press, cycling, and getting another. Now, we could get pedantic and talk about, well, what about malfunctions? What about a tap rack? You should be working on those too. How many reps? Should you get a trigger press after every single draw stroke? Depends on how much of the skill we're going to isolate. And as you can see, this conversation can get a little more complex than maybe you thought it was going to be getting into this. If you're going to isolate trigger press, just think about, is what I'm doing actually realistic? The answer is, it's not. So, trigger press, there's no recoil. I'm reaching up here to reset the gun. The only time I would do this under live fire is if I experienced a malfunction. And if I experienced a malfunction, would I not tap and rack before I got my next trigger press? So then the discussion becomes, am I building incorrect pathways by performing things in certain ways under dry fire and certain ways under live fire? I'm of the belief that we're thinking animals, and we can differentiate between the two settings. And that's where dry fire, we have a serious problem. My personal feeling is, when it comes to actual trigger press, the best dry fire for trigger press is live ammunition. Everything up and to that point should be practiced religiously. But trigger press itself is not something I actually spend a whole lot of time on in dry fire. That may be surprising, but nothing replicates live ammunition in live conditions. So if I want to isolate shooting on the move, I'll grab my SIRT pistol and I'll walk around the house and get my sight picture on my light switches and my power outlets and break rounds. I'm not so worried about the trigger isolation at that point as I am about making sure I have a steady sight picture and making sure I get hits. But when it's time to work and focus and isolate just on that trigger, I'm going to go to the range with 50 rounds of ammo, and I'm going to take that 50 rounds of ammo and break down step by step everything that I want to do. One round at a time, I'm going to get my trigger reset anticipation. I'm going to work on my accuracy, work on my precision. It does cost me more because that's 50 rounds of ammunition I wouldn't normally shoot, but for me, when it comes to dry fire, the actual trigger press and trigger isolation isn't part of it. Yeah, I may have committed a cardinal sin by admitting to the world that I don't focus on trigger press and trigger reset and dry fire, and I don't. Like I said, the only time I really do it is when I'm working on a technique that involves the trigger, such as shooting on the move or something like that, or that first press out of the holster. Honestly, it's very hard for someone, it would be very hard for someone to convince me that actual dry fire trigger press is going to benefit me in any single way in actually shooting the gun. I know people who spend a lot of time working on their trigger press, and it doesn't actually improve their accuracy. What improves their accuracy is shooting live ammunition, because ultimately that's what we're working on anyway, right? It's hard to come up with an analogy for it, but it's like thinking that, you know, I'm going to practice everything up into the motion, but not the motion, expecting it to improve the motion, if that makes any sense. I don't have to use live ammunition to practice my draw stroke, practice my one-handed draw stroke, practice pulling the gun from laying on my back, or performing a slide lock reload or an emergency reload, or even fixing malfunctions. I don't need live ammunition for any of those things. But for live ammunition, I need live ammunition. So instead of spending my time when I go to the range just, shooting bill drills and going for time and working plate racks, let's take 50 rounds of that ammunition and break down our trigger press under real conditions, under live ammunition, and see where our inefficiencies are. If you do that, your 50 rounds will take you very, very far. So now you've got a lot of good, solid, repetitious training for $10. Plus, range fee and targets and gas and range, and your time, of course, is the most valuable thing there. But I think it's going to benefit you far more. And I know this video is about dry fire, but this is part of my conversation. This is part of my technique. It's going to benefit you far more than it is to actually work that trigger reset, because that motion doesn't occur anywhere else in shooting. It's literally an artificiality that we use for trigger press. Are there solutions out there to replicate? Yes, the SIRT pistol is great. I already told you I hate the trigger in the SIRT pistol because it doesn't feel like this at all. It's not even close. It feels like a game gun, which is kind of what it is. Now, don't get me wrong, the SIRT pistol is a great training aid, but when it comes to the trigger, I'd much rather shoot live ammunition if I'm working on trigger press in my practice. Now, what else is there? We've talked about the draw, we've talked about the trigger, we've talked about repetitions and reloads and slide lock and working malfunctions and things like that. What about those of you who use an RMR? Are you practicing picking up that dot? Are you practicing focusing on what you want to hit, draw clears, press out, dots where I want it to be? Is the dot where you want it to be? You can get really, really proficient on picking up that dot without firing a single round, just based on taking a large target and then slowly working your way down in size and in distance, and talking about presentation, press out, dot's going to be roughly in the neighborhood you want it to be. The biggest mistake people make with these is trying to treat them initially like they treat their iron sights. Look at what you want to hit. Gun comes out, press out, dot's going to be roughly where you want it to be, or right where you want it to be, which is ideal. And as you get in those reps, that's good. Treat it the same way you would your sight picture, your sight alignment when you work your normal iron sight techniques. Now, what else is there in addition to that? Are you practicing your verbal commands? I know it feels stupid to yell at an empty hallway or yell at a piece of cardboard on a wall, but you need to start thinking about the mental game and getting the mental game worked into your dry fire time. I'm not saying spend 15 minutes yelling at a target on your closet door, but are you factoring in the possibility of drawing but not shooting? Is that part of your dry fire practice? That's probably going to be the best time to do it, because most people aren't really, in the rare times I do go to a indoor range, I don't see a lot of people practicing any of that. They're just shooting. And that's great because that's practice, but are we getting the total package for self-defense focused shooting? Whatever your dry fire plan is now, it may be working for you. Unique snowflakes. We learn in slightly different ways, and that's okay. One thing I don't want to do is for you to change and try to do things my way or the way that I suggested, and then end up not getting as excited or not getting positive results out of the new methodology that you're using. If what you're doing now is working, that's great. If you're not dry fire practicing, if you're not doing any dry fire practice, then you're wrong. You need to introduce something. It doesn't have to be daily, although I do recommend it. I think everybody, no matter how busy you are, you can find 5, 10, 15 minutes, hopefully 15 minutes, or maybe a little less, maybe a little more, to dedicate to dry fire every single day, no matter if it's 4 or 5 techniques that you're working on, or if it's literally just one, or something that's completely situational. Other things that you can work on. If you don't have time to actually handle a gun, you can work on clearing angles, or situational awareness, or all these other things. You can just what if it, mental gaming, things like that in your head. We want to make sure our plan is something positive and something that we look forward to, because if it starts to feel like a chore, then we start to go through repetitious motion, and that's when we build bad neural pathways, and that's when we tend to get sloppy, and we don't want to get sloppy with this stuff. We want our draw to be crisp and clean and perfect. We want our trigger press and our sight picture, and every single thing needs to be as perfect as we can get it, that constant, never-ending drive for success. 10 to 15 minutes, skill isolations. Don't overdo any one thing, because it can hurt you, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that every single rep, especially when you're learning a new technique, let's learn it right the first time so we don't have to go back and fix training scars. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics, trainer coordinator.